The attack on the nation's capital was a deadly uprising. It was a violent riot, and it was an insurrection. It was sedition. It was incited by the president, calling his supporters to action. I'm not used to using these words, sedition, insurrection, because it's not something I've had to describe in my lifetime. It doesn't happen in America. I'm sure a lot of us thought that. But it did happen this week. So let's call it what it is. Something that some people are having a harder time with than others, like this guy on Planet Fox.
What happened yesterday, telling us, wasn't simply that a political protest got out of hand after the president recklessly encouraged it. That is, in fact, what happened. But it's not what they're saying. Instead, they're calling it domestic terrorism. CNN describes it as an insurrection. Today, CNN unveiled a Soviet-style enemies list to make it a little easier to find all those Trump supporters and then destroy them.
And next, we will roll the tape on all of the president's enablers who have all helped to fuel the deadly insurrection at the U.S. Capitol.
The insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. It wasn't insurrection. It was a political protest that got completely out of control, as we said before, because the president recklessly encouraged it. And that's wrong. But it was not an insurrection.
Don't take his word for it. Don't take mine. It was an insurrection. Take Merriam-Webster's word for it. Insurrection, an act or instance of revolting against civil authority or an established government. And what is a revolt? A renouncing of allegiance as to a government or party, especially a determined armed uprising, according also to Merriam-Webster. But since this guy pretends not to understand big words in a truthful context, let's use pictures. These are people who have renounced allegiance to their government should it not be helmed by Donald Trump, knocking down barriers, knocking down gates, pushing police out of the way. Police would be the civil authority as described in the definition of insurrection. They broke windows and doors. They vandalized offices. The perpetrators forced members of Congress to take cover in fear of their lives. Those lawmakers are the, quote, civil authority, and the established government, as the dictionary states, that they are revolting against. The terrorists looted, and they bragged about it afterward. They climbed the walls of Congress, the established government that they were staging an armed uprising against. They threatened lawmakers, including a written message for the Speaker of the House left on her desk. At least one man had zip ties, as if he was preparing to hold someone against their will. This was an armed uprising. They were armed with anything they could get their hands on, and that included guns and other weapons, which the D.C. police chief said were recovered from the Capitol complex. The U.S. Attorney's Office said Molotov cocktails and the ingredients for making homemade napalm were also found. And there were pipe bombs found on the grounds of the Capitol and nearby outside the RNC and DNC. So it's interesting that when the crowd, in this case, is full of almost entirely white Trump-supporting rioters, Fox's Tucker Carlson describes it as a, quote, political protest that got out of control, especially when this is how he described Black Lives Matter protests and looting this past summer after the death of George Floyd.
For its BLM and Antifa, crazed ideologues, grifters, criminals, antisocial thugs with no stake in society, and nothing better to do than hurt people and destroy things. These are not protests. This is not about George Floyd. It's not about systemic racism, whatever that is. America is not a racist country. They flood the streets with angry young people who break things, and they hurt anyone who gets in the way. When they want something, they take it. What the mobs are doing isn't bringing people together, just the opposite. Riots don't heal wounds, they create them. Remember that when they come for you, and at this rate, they will. They're the armed militia of the Democratic Party. They're working to overthrow our system of government. They're trying to put themselves in power. That's all obvious now.
Tucker Carlson rolls his eyes at the idea of systemic racism, at white privilege, but perhaps he should roll those eyes on over to a mirror. It is entirely fantastical to think that crowds of black or brown Americans would have been treated as the mostly white insurrectionists at the Capitol were on Wednesday. He doesn't treat them equally. Yes, looting is criminal behavior punishable under the law. But what we saw on Tuesday is so much more than that. And saying otherwise is false equivalence. To liken the siege on the Capitol to the violence and property damage during the summer of Black Lives Matter is to ignore that this is the United States Capitol, the seat of government, at a moment in time when the vice president is presiding over a joint session of Congress, both the House and the Senate present, as they were in the process of making Joe Biden's victory in the presidential election, a fair election, official. This isn't a Target store. This isn't a statue. This is the Capitol, supposedly one of the most secure buildings on earth. And the difference in law enforcement's actions, Tucker Carlson says racism has nothing to do with it.
The Berkshire School in Massachusetts, a boarding school that costs $64,000 a year to attend, sent a letter to parents describing what happened yesterday as, quote, these acts of violence and racism. Now, if you're a literal person tied to outdated Western notions of linear thought and fact, that might confuse you. Racism? Whatever you thought about what happened yesterday, what was racist about it? Well, nothing, of course. There was nothing racist about it.
Since he needs things explained to him in pictures, here is one. An insurrectionist parading a Confederate flag through the Capitol. The inaugural appearance there of this symbol of the American states that tried to secede from this nation under the mantle of slavery, based on the belief that black people were inferior to white people and it was God's will to enslave them. When Tucker Carlson was arguing against the renaming of military bases named after Confederate generals and against the tearing down of Confederate statues, he said, quote, a country is the sum total of its history, good and bad. He said, quote, eliminating the past leaves us unable to say who we are. Well, he's trying to eliminate the present, and he is spoon-feeding it to millions of hungry viewers who tune into his show. Healthy societies do not destroy their own history, he said last summer. But what he didn't cop to is that he is part of the illness, a propagandist, a liar, a parasite.